I am on a quest to bake an extra sour loaf of sourdough bread. This week I baked my master recipe for sourdough bread, but I employed 3 special techniques that I found on the internet which promise extra sour results. The loaf of bread I got in the end was disappointing in more ways than one, and it definitely wasn't the sour loaf I was hoping for. I wanted to share this failure with you because honestly, this took me 4 days from start to finish, and I hope you don't want to waste 4 days of your time trying the same thing. Also, I hope you'll join me on this quest to make an extra sour sourdough bread. Here we go.
The first technique I tried was from the blog Pantry Mama, who says that using your starter when it's past its peak will make your sourdough bread more sour. This is commonly said online as well. When your sourdough starter goes past its peak, it has more acid, so it'll make the bread more sour. So I fed my starter on day 1 at about 2 p.m., then I let it rise for almost a full 24 hours. After 5 hours, it was about doubled in size. After 7 hours, it had almost tripled in size. Then on day 2, at the 19-hour mark, the starter had clearly started to sink down again as it had exhausted its food supply, and at the 22-hour mark, it had clearly sunk down even lower, and the starter was even tasting quite sour at this point. Things were looking good for technique number 1. When it came time to mix the dough, that's when I employed the second technique, using more pre-fermented flour in the final dough. I noticed that a recipe for King Arthur for extra sour sourdough bread used a greater portion of starter than I usually use in my recipe. So I decided to take this a step further and make a very large pre-ferment for my dough. Some might call this a sponge technique. Basically, I added all of the water, salt, and starter for my regular recipe, then I added just 300 grams of bread flour. This essentially created a very liquidy, 100% hydration dough that I allowed to ferment for 4 hours before adding the remaining 150 grams of flour that the recipe calls for. By doing this, I was allowing most of the flour in the recipe to ferment for a longer period of time, which in my mind would give the bread a more fermented and sour flavor. Once I had added the rest of the flour, I gave the dough 3 sets of stretch and folds with a half-hour rest in between each set. Then I let the dough rise at room temperature for another 4 hours. By shaping time, the dough was very puffy, bubbly, and light to the touch. I pre-shaped the dough into a ball, and then later I shaped it into a batard before letting it proof overnight in the fridge for 8 hours. The third technique I used was probably the strangest one. Hendrik from the Bread Code YouTube channel explained in a video that par baking his sourdough bread once and then finishing the baking the next day resulted in a more acidic and extra tangy loaf of sourdough bread. I was excited to try out this technique, even though it would extend my crazy experiment into a 4-day project. So on day 3, after my sourdough bread had proofed in the fridge, I preheated my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit for a half hour. And then I baked the loaf of bread for 30 minutes in my Dutch oven with the lid closed. Normally, I would only bake for 20 minutes with the lid on and then continue baking with the lid off, but I wanted to try to cook the bread to a safe internal temperature, but not fully bake it until the next day. The idea here is that by only par baking the loaf of bread, some of the acid in the dough would stick around and the flavors would intensify over time. So after letting the par baked bread cool, I bagged it up and stored it in the fridge until the next day. A full 24 hours later, I preheated my oven to 450 degrees again and finished baking the loaf of bread, this time for 20 minutes at 450 with the lid off. After allowing the bread to cool for over an hour, I was ready to slice into what I fully expected to be an extra sour, tangy loaf of sourdough bread. The 3 techniques I employed to increase the acidic taste in my bread made logical sense to me, and the bread even had a sour smell to it. But disappointingly, this loaf did not taste any more sour than my regular loaves of sourdough bread. It was definitely complex in flavor, it was well fermented, but the extra sour flavor just wasn't there in the end. In addition to that, I definitely would need to experiment with the par baking technique a few more times before recommending it to you, because although the loaf baked for 15 minutes longer overall than my regular recipe, the bread was still slightly gummy and underdone in the very center of the loaf, so it's not what you want at all. I fully plan on bringing you a recipe for an extra sour loaf of sourdough bread, but there are so many factors that go into it, and so far, I haven't quite cracked the code, but I'll definitely let you know when I do. Let me know in the comments below if anything has ever worked for you on your own quest to make an extra sour loaf of sourdough bread, and I'll see you in the next video.